Uh, just I guess just a quick introduction before I start going over the presentation is that, just like Susan said, I'm sort of always work with non-musicians, mainly because I'm not a musician either. For someone that I've gone through 15 years of studies and now teaches music production, I'd still hesitate to call myself a musician because that sort of invokes images of someone classically trained. They can understand very complex concepts of theories and so on. So things are completely alien to me. But on the other side, I keep thinking about all the stuff I and other people that we follow, the practices of digital music performance and how that can be related to the more traditional approaches to music literacy. Um, so I'll go through this presentation. Let me start sharing my screen and arranging all my Zoom windows. Just the usual provisions we have to do nowadays. Just let me make sure I am sharing the correct screen. Am I sharing the correct screen? Let me try that again. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, great. Okay then. So the first thing I should start by saying is that this is part of a new research endeavor for myself. So this is a field that I don't claim to possess expertise on, which I'm going to talk about which field exactly. But on reflection, it seems that something I've been doing since the beginning of my involvement with music, but I just did not know what it was called. So it's as exciting for me to be in a new place as it was accidental. I'm going to talk about how that came to be. So for those of you that are new to me, generally my research has been based on the wider field of sonic arts. And I've dabbled with a few different elements in my research, mainly looking at biology and how that can be used as a metaphor for collaboration between practitioners of different disciplines, and then using human-computer interaction methodologies, and then looking at intersections in the language and terminology between dance and music practices, and also looking at some of the social dynamics in collaboration through theories pertinent to Marxism and anarchism and a few other sort of high-level philosophical ideas. But on the nuts and bolts of it, I'm essentially an electroacoustic composer and also work in creating sound that is interactive and can be modulated by motion sensors. So admittedly, probably the least monumental of events to happen in the last year has been a sort of introspection of myself, started thinking, what am I doing? How can I call myself? And also the realization that most of my work is not mine, is actually joint with many, many collaborators I have the pleasure of working with and the privilege. And a small selection is here: Shauna, Joseph, Francis, Lucy, Kelsey, and Theresia. So starting to thinking, what is it that you do? Or more likely, I'm thinking the sometimes imaginary, but also has been many times real scenario of someone asking me, what do you do? And that's a very innocuous question, but also extremely complex for me to answer. And my approach was always, first of all, there's not what you do, is what we do, because it's always been a collaborative endeavor. And so once we pass that first obstacle, the next thing to deal with is the what. And I could call myself, as I said before, a composer or a producer of music, a recordist, going out and recording sonic landscapes, a disc jockey, although long retired due to bad ears, sound artist, which is a bit of a stretch because they're coming from a completely different lineage and it involves fine art in as well. And so the answer in, maybe I will choose one of them by chance in that discussion. The question would be, oh, so you're a musician? And I would stumble because of the reasons that I gave before, because I do not consider myself to have the training. If we exempt for the Frere Jacques, the one-handed rendition of Frere Jacques that I learned to play when I was 8, but that's really as far as my musical prowess can go on an instrument. So what is it that you do, Manoli? And the answer to that in a very inelegant way was, I perform live music, do so by manipulating sound through operating dials, buttons and switches on digital devices, as well as through motion sensors worn by the dancer. Which frankly is a mouthful. And also, although it does give a very detailed explanation of what it is that I do on stage, or perhaps what my practice is, it doesn't really situate me within any particular lineage. So by chance, and by looking what other people have been doing, and some of the literature that's been discussed around the topic of digital music performance, I came across the term controllerism, or the practitioner being a controllerist. And this is where I started to investigate. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that although this is a field that is very new to me, at the same time, the more I read about it, the more I understand, oh, that's exactly what you've been doing for all these years. So this is what I'm going to go over today. So as a summary, I'm going to explain what is controllerism according to some of the people that began the practice, or dubbed the practice. And then it's interesting to investigate the lineage of the practice that starts really early on from, arguably from some post-war experiments in the avant-garde, but mainly through dub and hip-hop music. And then I'm going to try to make a point of situating the non-musician within the practice of performing digital music as a controllerist. And then I'm going to do a little detour to mention what happened in the avant-garde between there and now. And finally, which is really the point of my current research, is I'm trying to make a parallel between interactive dance performance and controllerism, where in fact the dancer is the perfect controllerist. And this has been, although it might seem obvious now, but it has been a revelation for me, which I'm going to talk about later on. And depending time we have, I've also got a breakdown of one of my performances that showcases some of the approaches I took on trying to enable non-musicians, dancers in this case, to be active participants in the music making process. So first of all, what is controllerism? This was a term that was dubbed by Matt Moldover in the mid-2000s. And he gives a very sort of long-winded explanation on controllerism, and explains that it was mostly a reaction against the emergence of the laptop DJ that was happening at the time. As I will explain in a minute, this jockeys is a practitioner that is able to blend recorded music together as means of a performance. And of course, that was happening with analog equipment in the past, and that eventually in the beginning of 2000s emerged as a laptop practice as well, where instead of making a manual matching of speed between the records as in order to match the tempo, a system will do that for you automatically. So then there's been a lot of debate on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's cheating, or whether if there is such a thing as cheating in music creation and art in general. But regardless, there was a big backlash from the purist of turntable, of using the turntable as an instrument. So Moldover reacted to that by suggesting controllerism is a new form that allows a combination of past practices within, by utilizing modern digital equipment. And in the most succinct version, he describes it as the art of manipulating sounds and creating music live using computer controllers and software. Simple as that. Now to explain a little bit why controllerism as a term, and really that comes from the lineage of hip hop, which is turntablism, which was an offshoot of DJs. And really here Moldover again explains that These terms are essentially the same idea, but they revolve around different instruments, of course. So, of course, turntablism and controllerism borrow the names from the instruments that are used to create music. So DJs that emphasize performance and approach the tools as musical instruments needed to differentiate themselves from disc jockeys who just play records, therefore name themselves controllerists. So in the same way, performers who use computer technology as musical instruments needed a way to differentiate themselves from people who check their email. And for those of you that don't know, check the email is a sort of pejorative expression towards performers that appear to be checking their emails instead of playing music. So just again to explain a little bit the difference between turntablists and disc jockeys before moving further forward, and also just to kind of start sketching the lineage of the practice. So essentially the difference is that a DJ plays a set of songs, mix them together for live performance or recording. And to an extent, the aim of this matching is to have at least the tempo of the two tracks in sync. And then, of course, you can do other things on top to make the performance more interesting. On the other side, a turntablist using techniques such as scratching and manipulation of sound and samples, they're able to create a composition that can be distinguished as original compared to the sounds that are used or borrowed or appropriated towards that. So I've got here two of the finest examples of each practice. Jeff Mayles, who's one of the most well-known techno DJs and one of the pioneers of techno music, and Rock Raider, who was a turntablist as part of the Executioners hip-hop crew. So I'll just play just a few minutes of Jeff Mayles' performance and then Rock Raiders as a means to showcase what is the difference between the two practices.
Matter is rushing into it, sending out jets of intense radiation. This is the object rushing into it, sending out jets of intense radiation. Matter rushing into it, sending out jets of intense radiation. Matter rushing into it, sending out jets of intense radiation. This is the object that came into it, jets of intense radiation. Matter rushing into it, sending out jets of intense radiation. Rushing into it, sending out jets of intense radiation.
So in essence, what we're looking at here is a simplified version of what a mixing engineer used to do in order to prepare recorded music. But now, obviously, this goes probably about 10, 12 years prior to this, which obviously technology had already advanced to a point that this could be made into a format that is as mobile as it still remains analog. And of course now digital as well. But so this is a typical DJ performance where records will be matched manually, the tempos of them, and then with the use of equalizers, certain frequencies will be altered and blended together. And we can see as well that, of course, there's an argument that new compositions are made through the combination of 2 or 3 or more. But at the same time, it still appears as a playback medium. And it would distinguish that now from turntablism. This is the performance of Rock Raider. So the point to take from this is that the performance is much more akin to that of a musical instrument, and not only from the sound that is completely changed compared to the original when in relation to what Jeff Mills was doing before, but there's also the bodily movements. It's also all the virtuosity, and that looks a lot more close to that of a real instrument compared to someone that is doing a studio-based practice. So again, this is from 1995 with the DMC World Championships, which is an ongoing competition for turntablists. And there's some fairly strict rules about what is allowed and what is not allowed. And still, even though with the advent of digital technologies, the format is still the same: 2 turntables and a 2-channel mixer, quite often with limited amount of controls for equalization or filtering, and no effects either. So the point of that is that this limitation that makes this medium interesting. And this is something that still persists with controllerism today. So just to move on from what was happening then and what's happening nowadays, really the performance is still pretty much the same. The only thing that's changed is the type of controller, and instead of having analog signals going through mixers to be amplified and played through the speakers, now we have the same tactile information given by the hands, but this time send us digital information to the computer to manipulate sound. Two scholars, Van Vinatius, they have been discussing the advent of controllerism, and that discussion goes about 10 years ago now. And they are trying to make a stand for controllerism as what is the point of it? We have turntablism, why do we need this? And this is a follow-up from a discussion from sync DJs or laptop DJs. And the point they're making is that the new technology is welcome as long as it's pushing past the previous impossibilities. So in a way, freeing up the hands, ears, eyes to do something else. So controllerism shifts from turntablism, which was the restricted practice, that of using limited amount of equipment. Now we're coming closer to the live performativity of an electronic musician. And they make a case that the Akai pressure-sensitive drum pads was the first instrument to actually allow people to do that live on stage. And this is a selection of controllers that are available nowadays in the market. And so if we if we take into account what we saw with Rock Raider, let's try to keep that in mind when looking at this video now, which is of Team Exile, which is a very well-known controllerist, although he has not adopted that term. He was probably one of the pioneers even before Moldover came up with the term. So with in mind of Rock Raider's performance before, let's try to compare this with Team Exile's.
This is my live mashup.
I'll get back to Tim in a second, but the point of this is we see again there's an immediate connection between gesture and sound, which was perhaps something that is sometimes missing from the DJ performance compared to the turntablist performance. In both cases, the connection between movement or action or interaction with a controller will result in a particular sound or an evident change in the sound. And this is what Vantin and Attias describe as the virtuosity of controllerism and turntablism. And they also extend it to DJ to a certain extent, but I'll get back to that in a second. So obviously this is a quite old video now. This is from 2005. And all the equipment that Team Exile has. Some of these are self-made, some of these are some of the earliest MIDI controllers that were available mainly for use in the studio. And he managed to create a system that is mobile and reliable enough to perform on stage. And of course, nowadays the music industry has caught up with that and they have created all these devices that I showed earlier. So talking about the sort of linguistic concerns about how controllers came to be as a practice, where the name came from, but where it came from as a practice, as a music practice, is traced back a lot further, which is back to dub music. And one of the main advents that allowed that was the invention of multi-track recording. So whereas previously the only possibility to record sound was on one track or two tracks after stereo came to be in the early 50s, if I'm correct. Soon after, towards the mid 60s, we had the advent of multi-track technologies, which means that individual instruments can be recorded on discrete tracks. Now that allowed a wealth of possibilities for mixing to make the music perhaps louder, as it has been increasingly since the advent of multi-track recording, and also the possibility to apply individual processing on each of those tracks. This is something that producers were aware of, engineers of the time were aware of, and by mistake they were able to create a whole new genre of music. I mean, it's worth saying as well that nowadays this seems extremely archaic, and of course modern music software, they allow to have a visual unlimited number of tracks. So again, is to an extent the limitation that gives birth to creativity. So one of the originators of dub music is King Tubby, who in the early 60s, and of course, being this sound system series, I'm sure you're all familiar with the sound system culture in Jamaica and the West Indies in general. And again, it was a case of disc jockeys performing records one after the other, and quite often intersect with vocalizations over the music. Now, what King Tubby, what's interesting about him, particularly in relation to this, my research, is that he was not a musician. He was well known to be a radio repairman, and as a result, he was in constant demand by sound systems to come and fix the sound systems or maintain them or make them sound better than so they can have an edge over the competitors. And he was also a vinyl recorder, so he was able to, he was tasked with the job of turning recorded sound and to press it on vinyl. And also he then became a mixed engineer for what was probably the most well-known studio of the time, Don Coxone's studio in Kingston. And the story goes that at one time they had a guest mixer in, and he wanted to press a dub plate record, which for those of you who don't know, dub plate record is the sort of master that will then go to become a mold, which will then go and press the vinyl records. So it's a fairly soft, soft vinyl, which you could use maybe up to 10 times before it was rendered unusable. And in order to fit all the different multi-tracks in, the vocals were omitted. And they found out that the audiences, when they heard the backing track without the vocals, they were really into that, which again connects with the hip hop practice I'm going to mention later on. So King Tubby developed that idea and started to manipulate the discrete tracks of each instrument separately, using quite obvious effects. So to the point that the compositions were almost completely different to the originals. And here, so Guillermo de Lera Blanes is a Portuguese researcher that have looked into the lineage of controllers from dub through hip hop. And he created a transcription for one of King Tubby's most well-known compositions, which was the King Tubby mix Rockers Uptown. This is credited to Augustus Pablo, who really was composed some of the parts and also the melodica, but the engineering and the processing of the multi-tracks have been done by King Tubby. So obviously this is quite complex, and so I created a more simplified version of the original and the version of the dub of that. So I'm just going to play a few minutes of each one, so you can actually track the differences from each one. And you can see how the different instruments are set on the original: bass, drums, guitar, organ, melodica, and two types of vocals. And then how this has been manipulated through the use of effects on drums and guitar, and also how infrequent some of the melodic and harmonic elements have been introduced in the composition. So I'll play, I'll just kind of, I'll play a minute of it and cycle between the original and the dub version. Now the dub, and just notice how different it is from the original. Anyone that haven't heard those two songs, I thoroughly recommend them as an introduction to dub music. But So practice is one thing, and then the outcome is another thing. But the most important thing that is attributed to King Tubby is that he managed to elevate the position of the engineer into an artist in their own right. So no more is someone that is tasked with making the singers and the musicians sound as good as possible so they can be appreciated by the listeners, but in fact they become the performer and they create something completely new. And sometimes it became impressive and popular at the time in the Caribbean because it was something perhaps slightly incomprehensible, something that was a bit alien, something mysterious, which pretty much is what happened with turntabling as well. So to go back to, and as well I should say that De Blanes also suggests that dub music was also the first practice to introduce the notion of sampling, the notion of picking up segments from recorded music and manipulating them and reusing them in a new composition. And to an extent, the way the existing compositional elements are being brought in and out and also affected, yes, I would agree with De Blanes that this is a very early form of sampling. Now, this then moved over to the realm of hip hop. And in fact, there's a clear connection, cultural connection between what happened in Jamaica in the 60s and what happened in New York in the 70s. Which was actually a Jamaican native that created that, which was Kool Herc, or Kool DJ Herc, as he was known afterwards. And he's considered the father of hip hop. And he would, having experience, because he grew up in Jamaica, in Kingston, until he was 11 years old, then moved to the Bronx, having experienced the sound systems and how they operate and how they made people move, he came back and performed the same DJ style of blending two records together for audiences. However, having noticed that the response of the audience was mostly on the percussive element of the hard funk genre of music, as it was called at the time, so I guess James Brown and some of the offshoots of that type of music, he would then go and loop those sections that the audience responded most to. So I'll let him explain in his own words that technique.
One night, I'm waiting for the record to play out. I said, I wonder if I put that to myself. I said, if they're waiting for this particular break and I have a couple more records that's got the same breakup in it, I wonder how would it be if I put them all together. And I told them, I said, I'm going to try something new tonight. I'm going to call it a merry-go-round.
Herc's merry-go-round meant that instead of playing whole records, he would play just the instrumental breaks, mixing between them to create a continuous dance rhythm.
I started out with James Brown, clap your hand, stomp your feet. That part right there, when the break, boom, I had to come in with bongo rock. Bongo rock was still no vocals in it, and I would go into Baby Huey, the Mexican.
So more than that, what's interesting as well about Kool Herc is he never actually made a career in music. Neither was he a trained musician, but people like Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash, Grand Theodore Wizard, they all were nearly at the same time as Kool Herc within the hip-hop world as he was beginning. But what's interesting about Kool Herc is he never actually had a career in music. Someone that's probably most well known for introducing scratching and turntablism within the popular culture is Grandmaster Flash, with collaboration with Herbie Hancock. They created Rocky, which is the song that is cited by most people, most turntablists, as the inspiration of the first time they experienced turntablist scratching. And he defines looping as a structured series or process of which the end is connected to the beginning. Now, I've got a video that sort of shows that technique in more detail, but I'm just a bit conscious of time. So let's see if I can play just a very small segment of that.
Good afternoon, hip hop. We can even add another. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120 Every 4 bars of music going forward is 6 counterclockwise revolutions. Watch the line. Now watch very carefully. When I get to the right side, we're gonna start counting. That line there is the intersector. Let me set myself up on the right, and I'm gonna throw it. Watch
so obviously what's displayed here now is a technique that took many years and generations to develop. Now, what's interesting is another one of the luminaries of that early hip hop practice is they attest that this was actually done by mistake. So I'll just let him speak for himself.
Because when I cut it, it just had a percussion sound. It was like whoosh, 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 almost like a guica, but electronic, you know. And it just cut through everything that we had did. It cut through. It was something that I made a mistake at home, and the fella said it was dope, so I kept doing it, and I developed it, and then that's what I was doing. You know, it was that simple. You know, it wasn't like I'm going to make this ingenious sound. No, it was a mistake, and it worked, and I kept it.
So this is really the point that I was trying to say, that a lot of this, quite like what happened with King Tubby in developing dub, turntable started as a mistake, just as finding a particular sound out of a wrong move, potentially. And so if we compare the scratching that we could hear just now on Rocket and some of the affordances of digital technology, of modern digital technology, where we can actually emulate scratching with software. Just pay attention to the difference in the sound, in the feel of the sound. So great, this is an amazing technology that makes us create a very convincing emulation of scratching. However, this is the same, we come into the same problem as having a real drummer or having a drum machine because you can't find a drummer, or maybe your drummer is not very reliable, which I know a lot of bands having issues with. So the difference really here is it was in the imperfection and the mistake of the performer, or the non-musician performer, if you will, that gives the scratching his signature sound. Now, similarly, when we're coming to controllerism can be considered something that is not necessary. And Holly Herdon has a very interesting quote, thinking that controllerism is a fascinating research. I love that people get really nerdy about it. But at the same time, what I'm trying to do is communicate. And since, in her own words, her voice is already, and what it does with the voice is quite alien, having another layer of complexity with all the equipment and the controllers are in front of you will just create another barrier for the audience to understand what is happening. And to an extent, I completely agree with Herdon here. It is a level of complexity that perhaps could be a barrier. But at the same time, the controller itself is what allows the human to interfere with the sound and create that imperfection to make it sound realistic and make it sound like an instrument rather than something that is programmed. So this is really to go against the argument that why you're doing this live, you could just program it and play it back, but then it's not a live performance. And this is really, the notion of whether this is a barrier or not encapsulated in Matteo Derrico's thesis, where he goes to explain controllerism as a practice that it can be accessible, definitely in the year 2016. He goes to say digital musicians distinguish themselves as musicians in the context of a media landscape in which music producers and performers use the same tools as office workers, or perhaps people shopping or watching Netflix, children learning how to use computers for the first time. So the controllerist movement integrates hardware peripherals with laptop computers in an effort to foreground the corporeal live nature of performance in the digital age. And in doing so, controllerists imply that the underlying cultural balance of performance with digital computer music tools is similar to existing practice of musical performance. And indeed, quite like turntablism came to be popular because people could understand what the instrument was. A turntable is a household item by the time it became an instrument. They would be interested at the innovative approach of using it and creating sound with it. And especially nowadays, if you look at controllers, they don't look that much more complicated than, say, one of the new fridges that you have to connect to the internet in order to create ice cubes or something, I don't know. But so I guess what Herden was referring to before is a quite early immature version of digital performance where people do not know what it is that you're doing on the stage. But there's a way to overcome this, which I'm going to go into in a minute when I start talking about interactive dance. And again, just another quote from Van Veen and Attias, in that talking again about the imperfections, which is what creates our tension, which again, what makes people react to a great play of an acoustic instrument rather than listening to a recording of it, because I can actually see the performer, they can see the immediate connection between gesture and sound emanating, and of course, appreciate the mastery and the technicity that goes into playing the piece as close as possible to what the composer intended, but also as well understanding the tension and the effort that goes into that. So again, Van Veen and Attias mentioned that the difference between sync DJs and those that mix by ear will be this palpable tension that could go through and emanate into the crowd. So this is what I had to say really about the controllerist practice and its lineage. And now, so obviously this is all stuff that's been said before, and I'm just presenting them here as a collection. What I'm looking at mainly with this new endeavor, research endeavor that I've started, is how can I make parallels between controllerism and interactive dance? And really for that, we need to look back at sort of the post-war experiments in tape music. People like Alvin Lucia and Steve Reich would manipulate the emerging technologies of multi-track recorders towards creating compositions, but they were still perfect in a way. By perfect, I mean something that can be replayed in a very close form as it was intended from the composer. Enter John Cage, who, of course, he was most well known for his indeterminism in music and also the lack of having a clear score, and rather instead provide a set of instructions for the performers to interpret. And by 1965, he collaborated obviously with his long-term work and romantic partner, Mercer Cunningham, who was a choreographer. They collaborated with Robert Moog and Billy Clover to create a system for a piece called Variations 5. So that was two sets of motion sensing analog equipment. One is those proximity sensing antennas that you can see on the image, and also another set of photosensitive cells that would, and both systems will react to movement and trigger some of the tape machines where the sounds that Cage had stored on. And this, of course, will be controlled by the performers. But by controlling, it means unconscious controlling. Because, of course, although the dancers were following Cunningham's very strict choreography, they were not aware of how the movements will affect sound. So I'll just play a very short clip of the 65 performance. So again, we see now the notion of the mistake, the notion of the imperfection come into play as early back as 65. So it wasn't turntablists or dub producers that made it. In fact, it's something that was permeating research in music, in popular music, as well as the avant-garde. Now, there have been some theories about what was the opinion of John Cage on wanting to have dancers not have fine control over the sound. But in reality is, looking with hindsight of 50 years of digital technologies, the reason they could not control it with precision is because the equipment did not allow that. Nowadays, that problem does not exist anymore. We have a heap of technologies that allow us to have very detailed control a very detailed extraction of data from movement that they can be used to manipulate sound, visuals, or any other digital media. And it can be either worn systems or wearables, as they're called, or camera-based systems that create a sort of skeleton of the body. And of course, many have gone to integrate gaming controllers, particularly wireless ones, with off-the-shelf software. And this again gives a further hint towards the notion of controllerism, because controllerism is a practice that largely largely uses off-the-shelf technologies as opposed to some of the bespoke equipment that are used in modern research in human-computer interaction. So just an example, just to compare what was happening in the 60s and what's happening nowadays, is a piece by Physica. And again, that's about 4 years old now, this piece, but it just shows the level of control that is possible with modern equipment. So, of course, Physica's work is very impressive, but what I identify and what I'm trying to understand is what exactly, and I'm sure many of you as well, is what is the connection between movement and the resulting manipulation or creation of sound and visuals. And this is what researchers in interactive performance are calling as legibility or transparency, which is defined as the direct relationship, excuse me, the direct relationship between movement and the musical consequences. And indeed, this is something that is often cited as an issue of modern interactive performances. And sometimes the connection, this immediate connection that we had before with a musician gesturing, performing a gesture on the instrument and sound comes out of the other side. This is sometimes lost because of the complexity of the systems. And indeed, a lot of the systems are based on algorithms which have an evident effect on the composition and the development of the piece, but more on a macro scale rather than the immediacy of an instrument. So, what I want to do now, just to conclude this presentation, is to go over a piece of that I've developed alongside a few dancers and explain exactly what's happening and show some examples that give a three-dimensional perspective of what the dancer is doing, what the musician is doing on the controller, and what the software is doing. But so very quickly, a typical path from gesture into interaction starts obviously with the dancer's movements, and in this case, the movements are being tracked by a pair of motion sensors, one on the forearms, which is just essentially a Wii remote. Some of you might know it if you're old like me. And then obviously, because it's a gaming controller, the data has to be translated into a usable format. And this is done by an application called Oscillator. And then this is sent on to a software called Ableton Live, and I'm able to attach each of those incoming movement data into different parameters. Now, the way I do it, usually you would go and attach them directly on some of the effects or some of the synthesizer parameters, but instead I try to create a matrix by which I can then go and distribute those incoming movement data into parameters at will and change those. So I'm using those two devices. And again, this is all off-the-shelf devices, nothing programmed by me or made by me. Because quite like I'm afraid to call myself a musician, I'm also afraid to call myself a programmer. So I try to use as often as possible just off-the-shelf devices in unorthodox or creative ways as much as possible. So those two systems essentially will become a matrix by which the attached movement data can then be distributed into a further matrix and then finally reach the destination, which is the sound processing parameters. And so this is really how the movement makes the way into the system and onto manipulating sound. The musician's role now is to control, not traditionally, a controller would control the parameters of sound manipulation directly, but instead, since the dancer is doing this in my performance, what I'm doing is arranging how much of the control is available to the performer at each given moment. With a series of those two controllers. And to look at it more graphically, the pathway will be like this. Data will be captured, go to Oscillator for translation, and then the 4 different tracks in this way of movement will go into the system, and my controllers will then allow these to go through or mute them or change the range by which they can change those parameters. And I'll show you this on a video. Here you can see a demonstration I've done with Kelsey Cunliffe. And you can see what I'm doing on the controller, what Kelsey is doing with movement, and how the movements are coming into those attachment points. And you can see when I move those controls, what changes is nothing on the sound processing, but the range by which the dancer is able to manipulate sound. So there's 3 modes of interaction, which if we have time, I'll go over them. So this is one example, and in this particular mode, we have taken into account the provision and what the performer is aware of and what is not aware of. In this particular case, that we call it mutualism, the performer actually is extremely well accustomed to the system. They know and they can predict how the system will react with the movement, and they're also aware that as the piece progresses, the range of the effect will change accordingly. So is sort of a structured improvisation in this case, where the performer has to anticipate, so the sonic outcome can be anticipated, but not entirely determined. Now, this is on the other side from what we call commensalism, where the performer is actually not aware of how those changes will happen. So, and their instruction really is quite like a choreographer will instruct them to do certain movements. The instruction is to ignore the interaction and just move according to whatever it is that they hear. And what I'll do here is a different controller this time. I'm just switching on and off the data tracks coming into the Ableton, and they are then going and affecting some of these parameters, as you will see. So the provision here is that of an entirely free improvisation, both from the side of the performer, and also this sort of trick of switching tracks on and off also has its roots obviously in the dub approach of performing music, but also to an extent is a way to avoid the performer learning the system while they're performing, because it's very typical of performers to, obviously they're curious creatures just like musicians are, and they will want to know what it is that they're doing. And the first thing we will do, okay, so if I do this movement, that would make it louder, or this will make it brighter, this will make it longer, or this will make it choppier. So of course, by changing this at will, at random points, they avoid this learned experience and they're more free to improvise. Now, on the final mode is what we call parasitic in a way, in that the choreography is restricted in order to create a specific sonic outcome. So the performer doesn't need to know the system that well. As long as they follow the choreography, quite like they would do with a traditional performance, the sonic outcome will be the same. And although that poses some limits, it also allows them to create something interesting within the limitations posed by the system. And again, reflecting what was happening with the earlier practices that we discussed and how limitation was giving a sort of a fertile ground for creativity. Okay, so that pretty much brings me to the end. Thanks for being patient. Those of you that know me already know that I talk too much. Lo and behold, I did it again. So just to give a shout out to Michael Filmowich, who's editing a volume where this research is going to be published early next year, hopefully. And yeah, I'm very much invite any discussions on any of the things that we discussed today, because that will be extremely useful for me to get some feedback and perhaps something I may have missed.
Thanks a million for that. Yeah, that was great. I see a hand up there already. Marcus is jumping in there fast.
Oh my God, I'm doing the classic thing of not unmuting myself. I'm so sorry.
You're here.
Hello, good to see everybody. Hello. That was so, my mind is kind of blown. Like, yeah, but I think I have a really simple question, which is kind of, I didn't know about the concept of controllerism. And I think, as you know, I also do electronic music. And I remember your gig, which was really good.
Yes, I remember. Yes, at the church.
Yeah, exactly. And oh wait, I didn't really even, sorry, I haven't been at the computer all day. I didn't even adjust my camera or anything. Yeah, I was just thinking, isn't it kind of paradox that when you use like hardware, like a controller, to build a bridge between you as a performer and the audience, but at the same time, some of the sounds that you or I or anybody else uses in that context is still produced within the box. You see what I mean? So you control like certain effects and stuff and make it more tactile and more approachable, but at the same time, it is still in the box. Just like, I just think it's quite interesting to think about that.
Yes, indeed. I mean, but the sound of a guitar is in the box. If it was just some strings on a piece of stick, it would not create any sound. It's actually the box that will amplify the sound. And the same thing goes for really any acoustic instrument. So the difference, although obviously our sounds in the case of electronic performance are hidden within the processor and hard drive of our computers, or in the case of using only hardware, which is very popular nowadays, there's a whole anti-laptop movement in live performance. People will only use synthesizers and hardware equipment rather than laptops. But the point is the same. The sound is hidden within those devices. The point of the controller is to not create new sounds, but make it obvious which movement is creating which sounds. And of course, just like Vantin said in the call before, that doesn't mean you only have to do it that way. We don't need to go back to turntablism, where you had very crude equipment by which to make a performance interesting and engaging for the audience. But you can augment it and you can expand it with the availability of technology. So I guess I'm not concerned at all from the fact that the sound is hidden in the box, because as long as you can provide some legibility, some transparency in which gesture operates with sound and manipulates with sound, then I think that can be as engaging as playing a real instrument or a real acoustic instrument.
Just a thank you, because I feel more credible now as an electronic music producer and performer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Marcus. Shane has their hand up there as well.
Hi, Manoli.
Hey, Shane.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I'm going to lower my hand now. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I just have a question about your systems, your compositional systems that you develop, because you mentioned something really that's close to my heart, and it's about what Grandmaster Flash was talking about, being kind of aware of the mistake and being able to jump onto that. And that to me that's composition, like in its pure rawest form, like to be able to like choose. That's the art of choice, I guess, right? To what extent do you have like the ability to make mistakes in your compositional systems? Like, can things go wrong? Not wrong, but can things happen that are unexpected, or, you know, that kind of way? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And yeah, mistakes all the time. And in fact, some of the earliest work, that the more sort of serious work that I was presenting in 2015 with Francis Kay. And what was interesting about the system, we had also contact microphones attached on the performer, so sound from those can be sent into the system, and the motion sensors would manipulate the effects that were affecting that. But in every performance, I was hearing sounds that had not come across before. So every time the system will make its own sounds. And at first, I hated that. I was thinking, how is that happening and what am I supposed to do now? But eventually I learned to live with it and learn to react to it. So, and to a large extent, there's another practice that I was involved with before in tandem with digital dance or interactive dance, which was zero input mixing, which was essentially creating feedback from mixers and using those tones for music making in a very loose term. But the practitioners of that approach call themselves catalysts rather than performers. So they're just there to initiate or trigger a series of events rather than have any absolute control over them. So quite often when I'm in the scenario of performing with a dancer, particularly in one of the first two modes that we talked about, the mutualistic and the commensalistic, where there's a level of improvisation involved, I'm more than happy for mistakes to happen. And I was sort of coaxed in the past by being around electroacoustic composers that everything has to be perfect, and what a neighbor's going to say if we play the wrong sound at the wrong moment. And yes, of course, that did affect me. And I was thinking quite often, okay, maybe I should have a lot of things recorded and maybe a couple of sounds for the dancer to play on. But then I thought, no, stuff that. It's not what I want to do. If something is not perfect, great. It shouldn't be perfect. A jazz player is not perfect. A classical, a classically trained violinist is not perfect. But of course, the orchestra will take away some of these emphasis from those mistakes. So similarly, of course, context is very important as well. If we are somewhere that perfection is expected, then okay, maybe we'll prepare something that is more determined. But is this mistakes and this tension that the DJs were talking about as well, that just makes it real and makes it be less digital, and it actually the digital becomes analog through the mistakes.
Yeah, it's that classic Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything. That's it, and that's always been the most interesting things to me. So yeah, great. Yeah, embrace the mistakes. Yeah, right on.
But of course, there's a limit to the mistakes, because if the system just stops completely and you have to reboot it, then that's an issue.
Yeah, that's bad.
And I remember some of the sort of safeguards that you had in your system while you were moving over it, that you knew if something didn't happen, then you have another motion or another gesture in the back pocket to make sure something will happen. So yes, there's always tricks like that that help you, mostly not as much for the composition or what was going to happen sonically, but just to give you confidence in the system that okay, if everything goes upside down, I know I can press a button and something will happen that will not just make everything stop. So yes, some safeguards, but mistakes are great in this context.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Has anyone else got a question? Gavin, you put something in the comments box. Maybe you'd want to kind of ask that. It was in relation to the development of edits, dubs, and remixes.
Hello. No, that was now a long time ago.
I know.
I was thinking actually, the dancers kind of made me. I can't remember who it was, but I was at something a couple of years back where whoever was on stage actually had their computer code up on a projector behind them.
Yes.
And it was, in a sense, quite alienating, I think, because there was so much of it. You couldn't, I think it's exactly as you say, it was not being able to tell which bits of code were doing what. And kind of you're looking at it going, ugh. Whereas something that's physically in front of you, I think it was probably always that reason why in the bad old days in the 1980s, when people were miming on top of the pops, they'd always try their best to look like they were hitting their guitar at the right moment, because otherwise it just looks stupid.
Yeah, except for Nirvana, we actually took the mic where they top of the pops.
Well, New Order also did one where they
actually played live, but Nirvana took the mic.
No, I'm sure there was one New Order where they just stood around looking at the audience.
Perhaps, yeah, I don't remember that. But I mean, the practice that you're explaining with the code is the Algorave format, which is sort of coming up from a lineage of live coding systems. Alex McLean is probably the person, and Shelley Knotts are the two people that are mostly well known in this field. And to an extent, you are absolutely right. It is alienating because you don't understand what the code does. But in the context of live coding, Algorave's, Alex and Shelley's work is very transparent because you actually see what are the inputs of the performers. And perhaps you can follow that some of the inputs, some of the new text will result in a change in the sound. And again, I'm the first one, trust me, I'm the first one to put down live coding as a practice, because if we're talking about DJs looking like they're checking their emails, live coding is exactly that. It's actually replying to that email, not just checking it. Yeah. But Algorave has broken through that barrier simply by projecting the code. I don't agree with everything they say. They suggest that we are projecting the code so we can prove that we're not cheating and it's not recorded. I'm thinking, what is cheating in art? It's something that I don't accept that it's something else cheating in art. It's the same thing as to talk to my students. They say, oh, for the assignment, is it okay if I use presets? Like, of course it is, yes. Does it sound good? That's what I care about. And can you understand why it sounds good? Although, and I do make a point in the book chapter about that, algorithms can be probably the one thing that brings the most barriers between legibility and understanding of the audience from what's happening in the sound. But in the case of Algorave, they have done quite cleverly broken that barrier as much as it's possible to do with live coding.
Thanks, Gavin. I was just thinking really about the whole idea of interaction transparency and how that plays into this idea of authenticity. And when it comes to the live electronic performance, so what does that mean? And I think that idea of interaction transparency and movement is really key, especially if you've got like electronically devised instruments that were analog, yet you still have an interface with them. I'm thinking more like digital theremins, where you have movement maybe over a keyboard, so there's something happening there, but the audience doesn't necessarily know what sound is coming from that, but there's still movements happening, so they can interact with that to a degree as well. So yeah, I'm just wondering about those debates around authenticity.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And in fact, the Guillermo de Lera Blanes, whose master thesis is the one kind of that gave me an understanding of controllerism, has gone in length, talked at length about authenticity and what is authenticity in controllerism and turntablism and all the practices that we've gone over. And authenticity is coming up as a point of interest because of the argument that sampling is not music, and if you take other people's work, it's not your work, and so on and so forth. But these are arguments that have been put to rest years and years ago, from John Cage talking that every previously made sound is therefore to be recontextualized and remanipulated into a new format. Same thing with collage artists, same thing with graffiti artists, vandalizing, to use the wrong term, billboards or any sort of commodities that we're surrounded by, any imagery that is unnecessary except for use of capitalism. So to an extent, authenticity is mostly about what you do with the material, not the material itself. And of course that extends beyond digital performance and music in general. So authenticity, I guess, is to try to create your own system of performance. And that's something that is a bit problematic at the minute, because although obviously instruments, they have their own notation that's been developed over years and years, eons of development, and even turntablism has its own system of notation. Controller is not quite there yet. And in fact, to an extent, one thing that is holding back is the complexity of the system, firstly, and also the different manufacturers competing for your attention and creating different ways of going about it. So you have Native Instrument with Machine telling you can do this and this way and this way. Ableton with Push telling you can do this in this way and that way. Then Akai will come with something new, and Sensei with the multi-polyphonic expression system will come through and tell you to do it this way. But authenticity really is taking maybe a combination of all these approaches and making something out of it for yourself. So maybe the sound is not, and again, going back to what Shane was saying, maybe the sound is not that interesting and is not that stable, and maybe there will be a lot of mistake and indeterminism. But then if we're talking about authenticity, authenticity would be to make your own system out of what you have available and make something interesting, quite like turntablists did with the very limited instruments that they had, or the limited capabilities of the instruments that they had.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real movement at the moment about not being prescriptive in what kinds of performances can take place. I don't know if anybody has been involved with EMOM, the electronic music open mic. It's kind of started in Manchester, but it's sprung up in lots of different places. So it's grassroots led. And the whole idea is anything goes as long as it's not an acoustic instrument. So if it's manipulated through processors, that's fine. But people get like 5 or 10, 15-minute slots at the most to set up and pack down. And you can perform in whatever way you want at those events. So they've kind of got their own currency within them. So I think there's definitely that interest in, you know, overstepping the boundaries of what authenticity is and what a kind of electronic music performance can be in those contexts. That puts the standard open mic night to the test, I think. Yeah.
So, talking about open mics, it just reminds me of another thing that is worth bringing up, both in relation to authenticity, but also about affordancy of technology. And it's similar to the uncanny valley of how whether a robot is acceptable and the closer it gets to looking like an actual human. So an example of that in news performance is Beardy Man. He's a beatboxer who has actually developed a very impressive system for manipulating his voice. Now, if you look at his first work, he was great. He can mimic pretty much any instrument, any drum sound. He can actually feels almost like there's a polyphonic multi-timbral quality in his voice. And now the system allows him to have such control over create a composition out of looping different segments that he makes with his voice that it sounds like a record. And I was listening to that, I was thinking, well, what's the point? Put a record on then. This is some of the problems that we have with technology that is too good at some point. It gives you so many possibilities and the sound is so clear that is indistinguishable from the starting point. So again, I didn't put anything in the presentation because I want to research this a little bit more before I start ranting about it. It's one of my principles. But there is something to be said about that. And maybe it goes back to what we're saying with Shane, that the mistake is what makes the performance look real rather than programmed. And perhaps if we make it too perfect, then, well, might as well record it.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Probably one of the most boring live concerts I've seen, and this is from a standard band, the Divine Comedy. They were so perfect on stage. It was just it left me cold, the performance. So yeah, it's that imperfection in a live performance, whatever way that's done, using whatever instruments or movements or interaction with the audience, I think is what makes a live performance and, you know, encourages that interaction between audience and performer as well. Shane, did you want to come back in with something?
Yeah, I just to kind of to echo what you were saying there, Manoli, with the, you know, is the example you had there of I don't know what software it was or what plugin it was where you could kind of emulate scratching, you know, but you could hear, like in your example, like it's very clinical. It's like, you know, it's quantized, it's on it. But the issue as well is you're beholden to the affordances given to you by the programmer or the designer, you know. Whereas if you're hacking something together yourself with whatever you got, maybe it's not the best thing in the world, but it's to use authenticity again, it's authentically you. And yeah, I guess there's there's an issue, I guess, with there's a ton of lo-fi hip hop at the moment, which is just, I don't know if you've ever seen this just like I get advertised for this plugin Drip. And
yes.
You get like you know, press it once and it does the thing for you, but then you just end up with all these kind of this monoculture of music that's all just kind of come from this programmer. Who is the programmer now? The composer, you know? It's anyway, food for thought. I don't know enough more than to rant, but
it makes sense. And to an extent, yes, I agree. If you make your own thing, there is a level of authenticity that goes into that. But you know, hacking can take many forms. And although I've dabbled with Max, I've dabbled with Python, I've done all this, and I just find it so uninspiring whenever I do it. I know the value is great and what I can achieve is amazing with programming and all these systems, but I just don't have it in me to do it. So instead, I guess I hack humans and in the way they move and the way they interact with the systems. And myself as well, trying to, because turntable is very much a hack. It's quite counterintuitive the way you have to operate the system in order to make it sound the way it sounds in some of the best sounding turntablist performances. So similarly, Even the Time Shaper plugin that I showed earlier, yes, is very mechanical the way it's demonstrated, but with a little bit of care and a little bit of, you know, clever programming, you can make a very good emulation, and you can make it sound. You can introduce some of the mistakes that real performance have, without, of course, reaching that same level of immediacy that you would have with a turntable. So yeah, no, I take your point. Yeah, authenticity can come with making your own stuff as well, but also authenticity can come from using existing equipment in very unorthodox ways. You know, Jimi Hendrix cracking up his, you know, his guitar amplifier, or the 303 being a guitarist accompaniment for bass, bringing, you know, giving us acid house and a whole new genre of music. So, and again, it's the same thing with King Tubby, where he would actually make his own mixers and his own effects before this started becoming commercially available, and then other people will take them, those ready off-the-shelf devices, and make some incredible music with it. So, and again, so if I was to say, is King Tubby more authentic than Lee Scratch Perry because he was making his own equipment rather than Lee Perry using the existing ones, I would pay less attention to the equipment, but rather how the equipment were used. And again, this is just me. And I completely appreciate the work that goes into making your own software or programming your own software and your own devices, which quite often I'm envious of people that are able to do it. But, you know, it's kind of, I'm trying not to do too much. So, yeah. So at the minute, you know, I'm concentrating on how I can organize humans in operating a system in a way that makes sense according to the tradition of the practice, let's say.
Yeah, right on. Like, I've spent far too long looking at a load
Let's
of code.
collaborate.
Looking at a load of code and be like, oh, I haven't made one musical note in the last month, you know. So yeah, just that
easy
too.
to get into that. Yes, it's very easy. But yeah, let's do something together at some point.
Well, I think we're running out of time there, so just want to say that was absolutely brilliant. And can I just point out that when you were showing some of the clips of the dancers in motion, all I kept thinking of was Tron. So I have visuals of Tron going through that session there. So there's obviously the science fiction element behind all of this too.
Absolutely.
So thanks a million for that. That was really great, fabulous discussion from everybody as well. Just to let you know, just in case anybody had tickets booked already for our final talk, unfortunately, Mandy Wigby can't make it, but she will join us in the next round when we're going to work on the theme of digital. So actually, this is a really great one to end on because it brings us into next year's series as well. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be advertising that in the coming months. And thanks again, Manoli, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Susan. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And thanks, everyone, for your questions and the discussions and the comments. Yeah, I really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
That's brilliant. Thanks.